Hello students, and welcome to Political Science 1513.W1, American Federal Government Online. Let's begin with a bit of an overview. In today's lecture, we're going to tackle 3 individual points, starting with some basic housekeeping and then moving into original lecture content. So in terms of housekeeping, the first thing we are going to do is talk about where you should be right now and what you'll need to do before, while, and after watching this video. Then we're going to talk about some general principles that you'll need to understand as we move through this course's lecture content. In this video, we'll start talking in very general terms about what governments are, what they do, and why we allow them to do these things. We'll also talk about how they are unique from other forms of coercive or controlling organizations like crime syndicates and terrorist factions. From there, we're going to narrow the scope and we'll start to look a little more specifically at the United States in particular and our specific constitutional system of governance. To do this, we will begin with a general characterization of the Constitution as a whole, and then we're going to begin to break down and discuss some of its key principles and core components individually. Once we've done all of these things, then you are ready to complete your assignments for this week, take a break, or continue into the lecture and reading contents for subsequent weeks in the semester. I don't mind if you want to work ahead, but don't get too far, okay? Which reminds me, we do want to begin with that first point. So where should you start? Where should you be before you begin this video? Well, before you watch this video, I want you to make sure that you've completed each of the following tasks. If you haven't, you should pause this video and do so now before proceeding. So first, make sure that you have at least perused the content in the Start Here tab on our course Blackboard page. You will find a number of valuable resources here, including a tutorial video on how to navigate the course, various Southeastern resources, our course syllabus, and a variety of additional optional learning resources that I've supplied to help augment your learning experience. Please do be advised that any content provided on the Start Here tab, which is not specifically sequestered into the Additional Resources folder, is required reading and may appear on questions on any of your quizzes or exams throughout the entire semester. Second, make sure that you have reviewed this week's learning objectives. I'll include a simple Word document listing all of the learning objectives for each week, and you can use these to guide your studying and note-taking practices while you listen to lecture. Do keep in mind that these learning objectives are for our lecture content. Learning objectives for the assigned readings are going to be listed in the textbook itself at the beginning of each chapter. Finally, before proceeding in this lecture, you will also want to complete the reading assignment labeled A for this week. If you're not sure what reading assignment A entails, please refer to the description of this folder on the coursework tab, or else peruse the tentative course schedule attached to your syllabus. Do be mindful that that schedule is subject to change without warning. If you've done all of these things, feel free to watch through the rest of this lecture at your own leisure. You can pause, fast forward, or rewind as necessary. Just be sure that you are taking careful notes while you listen. For each week, I'd recommend completing all of these steps by the end of business hours on the corresponding Monday. Whatever timetable you choose to follow, however, once you have completed these steps and are done with this video, you should proceed to Reading B and then watch Lecture B. Both of these can be found in this week's coursework folder. My suggestion is to make sure that you have completed all of the required reading and viewing for each week by the end of business hours on the corresponding Wednesday. Once you have done so, you are free to start your graded assignments. You can complete these in whatever order you please, but my suggestion is to generally start with your discussion post, then your quiz, and finish with your assessment. I'd recommend following the same rules as you move through each week for the entire duration of this semester. All right, let's move on to our second major topic for the day. What are governments? Well, your textbook defines the term government as follows, and I quote, "The preeminent institution within a society. Government has the ultimate authority to decide how conflicts will be resolved and how benefits and privileges will be allocated." That definition, however, is a bit complicated, and I think that it's a little confusing to some students just because of the way that it's worded as a couple of different sentences. So let's simplify this a little. Government is the institutional setting where politics happens. I'll say that again. Government is the institutional setting where politics happens. It is the institutional setting in the sense that it's not necessarily a physical setting or location. You can take part in the government without ever stepping foot into the Capitol complex. And governments don't decay or erode, at least not in the same sense that a physical structure might. But they are established organizations within which activities can and do regularly take place. So think of it this way. Government is to politics as Southeastern Oklahoma State University is to your education. This is an online class, so most of you are going to be at home right now. Very few of you are actually going to be sitting on campus watching this video at this moment. Yet, you're still getting your education from Southeastern Oklahoma State University. And that's because Southeastern Oklahoma State University is an educational institution within which your education can take place regardless of your geographical location. Taking part in a Southeastern education does not require your physical presence. In the same way, participating in American politics does not necessitate a trip to Washington, D.C. So again, government is the institutional setting within which politics takes place. But what is politics? Well, there are a number of complicated ways that we could define this term as well. But I want to keep it simple. So, politics is the process by which we make collective decisions about who gets what, when, where, why, and how. Now, there are a couple of important caveats to this definition. First, I want you to understand that why I have emphasized the word collectively in the definition. Politics necessarily requires a group. If you were stranded on a desert island, you could not participate in politics. You might need to decide something like how to ration out your resources, but that would be a strictly psychological decision. It's all internal. You weigh the pros and cons and make a decision based entirely on your own considerations. But if we had, say, more than one castaway, a group of survivors on this island, then it's not enough for you to just decide what you want to do. You're going to have to get other people to go along with your plan or proposal. You can do this democratically by getting together to vote, or you can grab your proverbial conch shell and impose your will upon others through the threat of force. Either way, the moment you've got a group of individuals interacting to make collective decisions about who gets what, when, where, why, and how, that's politics. Making those types of decisions individually is not politics. It must be collective. The second thing I want you to understand about this definition for politics is that while it can and often is about material resources, that's not always the case. The what in who gets what, when, where, why, and how does not always refer to tangible goods like food or water. It can also refer to immaterial benefits like influence or special rights and liberties. International politics, for example, tends to involve a group of states interacting with each other to decide which of them will get what set of trade rights or who will control what plot of territory. Domestically, we do have to decide things like how much, if any, wealth we should redistribute from the top earners to the poorest people, but we've also got to decide things like who will get the right to vote or who will have the duty to sign up for the draft. Will we administer this responsibility fairly and require everybody to sign up for national service, or are we going to single out and target men? These are all political questions about who gets what, even though the what is not referring to any kind of a physical or tangible good. So now that we know what governments are, we need to ask, what do governments do? What are some of the main things that governments are responsible for? As with anything even remotely related to politics, the answer to this question is a complex and frequently debated subject. But, generally speaking, we can agree that governments need to do at least 3 things before we can think of them as functioning like a government. Note that not all governments succeed in all 3 of these areas. A failed government, for example, might not be able to enforce law and order because it does not have a monopoly on the use of legitimate violence and faces substantial challenges to its authority from, let's say, a rebel faction, such as the case in northern Mali, for example, or more tellingly in Somalia. Still, most governments do function, and this means that they do at least 3 things. First, they legislate. If you don't know, to legislate is to make laws. Governments create the rules that we have to follow. They tell us what we can and cannot do, as well as when, where, how we can and cannot do it. Second, governments use coercion and violence to execute and enforce the law. It's not enough just to tell people what to do. If you want to actually make a difference, you need people to follow those instructions, and this means that you have to be able to punish people who ignore them. Imagine, for example, that there were no consequences for breaking the law. In that case, these rules would actually be more like suggestions. And how many of us do you think would probably just ignore the law altogether if there weren't any consequences for breaking it? Now, I don't want to overstate this. If you've seen recent films like The Purge, you might be under the impression that without government coercion, we'd all spontaneously become mass-murdering rapists and sociopaths, and that's probably not true. With or without the government, most of us probably would not be willing to murder a pregnant woman, for example. And if we saw somebody else trying to do so, most of us would probably willingly interfere. So we probably don't need the government to stop us from killing each other willy-nilly. But, if you thought that you could get away with it, how many of you would choose not to pay your taxes? How many of you might try a little shoplifting or smoke some marijuana? Might some people be more likely to engage in spousal or child abuse if they could do so without being punished? Well, yeah, probably. So in addition to making rules that restrict things like domestic violence and shoplifting, the government has to enforce and execute those rules by punishing the people that violate them. And punishment, in turn, requires some form of physical violence or force. You cannot, for example, just take somebody to jail if they don't want to go. If they don't want to go, you're probably going to have to forcibly drag them off using physical violence or, at the very least, the threat of violence. Thirdly, and finally, governments interpret and resolve disputes about the law and how it applies to particular cases. Once you've written in a law you want somebody to obey, you have to be ready to help that person, group, or individual figure out what the law says and how it applies to their particular case. What if, for example, we got into a small fender bender on our way home after class one day? I'm completely convinced that it's your fault, and you're completely convinced that it's my fault. I think that under the law, you should have to pay for my damages. You think that under the law, I should have to pay for your damages. How do we resolve this disagreement and figure out how the law actually applies and what it actually says? Why? We'll turn to the government and ask it for clarification and application. The government provides a theoretically neutral mediator who can help us to figure out the complex, sometimes very confusing body of rules and regulations governing our behavior. And just as importantly, it has the power to enforce its decisions once it has mediated a dispute. If you decide that I should have to pay for your damages, well, even if you're right, that doesn't mean that you can make me do so. But the government can. Why? Well, because everything I have said so far can be summarized like so. Governments wield power. And this is a key concept, so take it down in your notes. Power is the ability to control others. The ability to get others to do things that you want them to do, but that they would not do absent your influence. Now, there are many types of power that an actor or an institution might hold. A very eloquent person might have persuasive power, for example, in that they could talk you into seeing things from their perspective. With a lot of money, you might also be able to influence others into doing what you want by paying them. But the government has what we sometimes call coercive power. Coercive power is a particular type of power. It involves the use of physical violence to impose your will upon others. This ability to use coercion and force people to comply with its wishes through the application of violence is sometimes called the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence or force. Basically, that means that the government is the only institution in society that is able to use violence or coercion to get what it wants and impose its wills upon other people and have this accepted by the general public. It does so in some very invasive ways. We like to think of ourselves as free, but here's a small challenge. Take a moment, pause the video, and draw up a list of things that you can do that are not illegal, taxed, regulated, or in some other way controlled by the government. Take about 5 minutes and then hit play. Okay, have you finished? It's not a very long list, is it? Well, that's because, again, our government today is extremely expansive and very powerful. It uses its monopoly on coercive power to do things that we normally would not accept. It regulates our health. It tells us what we can and cannot do to or with our own bodies. It tells us how much of our own hard-earned money we get to keep and how we can and cannot spend what money it does allow us to have. And we would never allow anyone else or anything else to do anything even remotely like this. Imagine, for example, that I, your teacher, decided to fix the nation's health problems and put an end to obesity. That's a respectable goal, but what would happen if I showed up at 7-Eleven with a firearm and told you that you would not be allowed to buy a Big Gulp or any other sugary beverage unless you paid me a monetary fee that I will then spend to try and promote public health? You would probably call the cops, right? And that's puzzling because depending on where you live, those same cops might be helping the government that employs them to do the exact same thing that I am trying to do. This is, for example, the case in Philadelphia, where you do indeed have to pay a sugar tax, an additional fee in addition to the cost of your soda if you want to buy something like a Big Gulp. So why is it okay for the government of Philadelphia to do this, but not for me? Well, there are 4 big reasons why people tolerate government's use of coercion and violence to control our behavior. The most obvious of which is that we don't have a choice. Why do we pay our taxes? Because if we don't, the government will send the police to arrest us. And why do we cooperate with the police once they arrive? Well, because if we don't, they'll use violence to physically force us into compliance. Now, some people might protest and say, no. We pay taxes because we want social benefits. But if that's true, why do we have to involve the police at all? If it was a consensual exchange in which we willingly contributed money in exchange for commensurate services from the government, then the government would not need to coerce contributions out of us. How many people do you know that willingly contribute more than the required minimum to the IRS every tax day? We know plenty of people who claim that they'd be willing to pay more taxes for a better funded government, but what's stopping them from doing so? Nobody really seems willing to give the government more than it demands. And that's because the real reason we're paying taxes is not for social benefits or a well-funded government. The real reason we're paying taxes is because we have to. The government will use force on us if we fail to do so. But, and perhaps more interestingly, we may actually want to give the government power over us because doing so can, in fact, be very useful. Very frequently, we find that people will allow the government to control us through the use of violence and coercion because allowing this makes it easier for us to achieve certain goals that would be difficult to accomplish on our own. In particular, the government provides us with security, theoretically neutral mediation of our disputes with strangers, and public services that would be more difficult to acquire on our own. Let's look at each of these 3 points in turn. First, as I've said, we want security. We want order and stability in our lives. We want to know what to expect from other people when we leave our homes. It's the same reason why we insist on having syllabi for our courses. You want a syllabus because you want to know what you have to do in order to get a good grade in this course. I want you to have a syllabus because I want you to know what I expect from you in this course. Well, governments do the exact same thing. They tell people how they can and cannot interact socially or economically so that we know what the rules are. I know that I can walk into a classroom without being attacked by a student who didn't like the feedback she got on her last essay. And I know I can do this because the government has made attacking people illegal. If I'm attacked, the government will punish the assailant, so I can feel secure in coming to work even if I've given somebody a bad grade. A more general way to put this would be to say that we want the government to protect us from force and fraud. From force and fraud. When I say that we want to be protected from force, what that means is that we don't want criminals or foreign armies to be able to do things like rape, kill, rob, or enslave us. And our government helps to make sure that these things don't happen. At the same time, we don't want to be defrauded. If you, for example, enter into an employment contract in which your employer agrees to pay you $30 an hour for your work, you don't want him to then turn around and try to pay you $12 an hour. And if he does, you sue. You go to the government and it forces him to live up to his end of the bargain. So you rely on the government to enforce the contract, or in other words, to protect you from fraud. Incidentally, maintaining order, protecting us from force and fraud, is generally considered the first and most fundamental function of government. This is the main reason why people create governments. Secondly, we want a, again, theoretically neutral mediator of our disputes. If we got into a car accident, once more, we probably wouldn't be able to agree who was at fault. We would need a neutral third party who could resolve this dispute. And we need somebody that we both trust to give a fair verdict. The government, again, at least in theory, doesn't have a dog in the fight. They don't stand to gain or lose anything regardless of who wins out in our dispute, so they can be, theoretically, trusted to render a fair verdict. Of course, we do know that that's not how it always works in practice. If you're an African American accused of a crime, for example, you might face racial prejudice during your trial. If you're a man in divorce court, again, you might not get a completely fair shake. But that's the theory. If we have a dispute, I stand to benefit from winning that dispute, so I can't be trusted to render a fair verdict. You stand to benefit from winning that dispute, so you can't be trusted to render a fair verdict. But regardless of how our dispute is resolved, the government doesn't gain anything, and so, again, it can hopefully provide us with a theoretically neutral mediator to help resolve disputes with strangers. The third reason why we allow the government to exert control over us and use violence or coercion is that we want public services that would be hard to get on our own or without the use of violence and coercion. We want things like libraries, roads, and infrastructure, and so on and so forth. But there's a type of what we call a collective action problem. A collective action problem is any problem which occurs when people stand to benefit from cooperating and yet fail to do so. And in particular, when it comes to governance, there's a specific type of collective action problem called the free rider issue. Okay? The free rider issue makes it very hard to achieve public goods if you can't punish people who don't carry their own weight. Think about it like this, like a group assignment. One student does all of the work while a whole bunch sit around, but everybody gets the same grade. Now, it would be in everyone's best interest overall if we divided the labor evenly. Everyone contributes a very little bit, and the overall workload is a lot lighter. But because some people are going to try and get a free ride, it doesn't usually work that way unless you've actually got a professor or a teacher or somebody who could make sure that the students who don't do their fair share of the work don't get the same grade as those that do their own fair share of the work. Public services operate in the same way. Everyone benefits from the roads, for example, regardless of who actually paid for them. So if the government isn't forcing you to pay, why not let somebody else cover the costs of building roads and get a free ride? No pun intended. This becomes a problem when those people who would otherwise be willing to help pay for the roads refuse to do so because they don't want you to get a free ride, and as a result, we don't get any infrastructure. The roads stop being constructed because nobody is paying. Well, because government can force people to participate, we don't really have to worry about this free rider issue. The government can simply punish those people who aren't paying their fair share and compel them to participate in helping us to achieve collective goals like building roads or libraries. So again, the government is using its monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, force, or coercion to help us achieve goals that would be otherwise very difficult to get on our own. However, it is important to know that governments are not the only type of organization that engages in this type of coercive activity. Consider the protection rackets of the American Mafia, for example. At their peak, members of the Mafia would basically take over neighborhoods and extort local business owners to pay them out a portion of the business owner's profit in exchange for security and the privilege of conducting business in a Mafia-controlled area. But what would happen if the store owners didn't want that protection and tried to refuse payment? Well, he or she would be punished, sometimes very violently, by the Mafia. Now remember that coercing others into obedience is a form of politics. It's a type of power. So politics does take place within the Mafia. And don't forget that the government also runs a sort of protection racket. We are forced to pay taxes which help provide benefits like police protection of our property. But what happens if we decide to opt out? Can you just choose to say, hey, you know what? I don't need the police to protect me, so I'm not going to pay my taxes and we'll call it a wash? Well, certainly not. And if you try, the government is going to use its monopoly on the legitimate use of violence to punish you, just like the Mafia would. So how are governments different from other types of coercive institution like organized crime if they both facilitate political processes, both wield coercive power, and both run protection rackets? Well, what we're going to find is that there are three defining characteristics that do tend to set the governments of the world apart from things like organized crime groups. And taken together, these three characteristics are what gives the government its monopoly on the use of legitimate violence. And that monopoly on the legitimate use of violence is, in and of itself, hands down, the single most important thing that distinguishes governments from other types of coercive organization. So let's look at these three characteristics, these three constitutive components of this monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, and see how they can help us to set governments aside by giving them authority and legitimacy and power like nobody else has. The first defining characteristic of a government is something that, again, we've already talked about: power. Remember, power is that ability to make others do what you want, and the governments of the world have more of it than anyone else. Certainly, the government has more power than your typical gang or mafia. An organized crime group like the mafia might try to force you to pay their tributes, but if you don't like this, you can go to the government and they'll send the police to protect you from those extortionists. But if you don't like paying taxes, tough luck. You can't turn to the mafia for protection from government extortion in the same way that you could turn to the government for protection from mafia extortion. Why? Well, because when push comes to shove, the government has tanks and jets and nuclear bombs. In other words, it's a lot bigger, it's a lot tougher, it's a lot more powerful than the mafia. Okay, so the first defining characteristic of government is that it has more power than anyone else in society. The second big difference between governments and organized crime is that governments are generally believed to have authority, the right to take or compel obedience under the threat of violence and coercion, the right to use coercive power. If I tried to force you to give me 33% of your paycheck, it would be theft. But if the government does the exact same thing, well, that's taxes. Why? Because again, generally speaking, the government is thought to be within its rights when it collects taxes. I, however, do not have that right. I have the right to give you a bad grade on an assignment if your work does not satisfy my standards because I'm your teacher. And because I have this right as your teacher, generally speaking, people don't give me all that much guff when I exercise that authority and do in fact fail somebody. But what if another student, not your teacher, but another student decided that they did not like your grade, and so he or she hacked into Blackboard and changed your grade from an A to an F? Would you be willing to accept that? Or would you be upset? Most likely you'd be upset. And this leads us to the next point. The third defining characteristic of governments is related to authority. Governments have more legitimacy than anyone else. To have legitimacy is to have popular recognition of your authority, popular recognition of your right to use coercive power. It's not enough to have authority. You also need people to acknowledge that authority. When people recognize your authority, you are said to have legitimacy, and they are more willing to obey you because they believe that you have the right to do what in fact you are doing when you try to control them. But if they do not recognize your authority, if you have no or limited legitimacy, well, they are more likely to resist and resent you or feel that you've done something wrong, something unjust when you try to control them. Think of this like a workplace. All right. All of your managers have authority to give their employees orders and assign duties. But sometimes the less popular managers have a harder time getting their underlings to take them seriously. If we see our bosses as incompetent, we might be less willing to acknowledge his or her authority than we would if she was an exemplar leader. The same can be said of governments. Even if I have the moral authority to use violence in a scenario as a way to impose my will on others, nobody else would recognize that. I'm not a legitimate authority, so people aren't going to allow me to use violence on them. They'll have the government dispatch its police to haul me in, and again, because the government is more powerful than I am, that's going to be a pretty uneven fight. So to summarize everything we've talked about on this slide, one more time, the government's most important defining institution is that it is able to use violence or coercion to impose its will upon people and have that accepted by the general public. If I tried to use violence to force you to give me your money so that I could feed the poor, people would largely decry that as theft. But the government does that exact same thing every day, and we totally are willing to accept it. And at the end of the day, this monopoly on the legitimate use of violence or force is what makes governments unique. The monopoly on the use of violence comes from the government's power, authority, and legitimacy, and sets it apart from other coercive institutions like gangs, terrorist syndicates, rebel factions, so on and so forth, which pretty much satisfies that second topic that I touched upon when I introduced the overview for today's lecture. Now from here, what we'll begin to do is to narrow the scope a little bit and start to focus our attention on the defining characteristics of our government here in the United States. And to do that, we're going to need to scrutinize our charter or plan of government, the United States Constitution. Let's start our discussion of the United States Constitution by solidifying some of our general principles and then working our way down. What is a constitution? Well, a constitution is a system of fundamental principles determining the powers, duties, and operational procedures of a governing body. In other words, a constitution is a system of rules for the rulers. When a nation adopts a constitution, it's providing instructions about how the government should operate, how that nation should be governed. What sort of government should the nation have? How should that government operate? What rules and procedures should the government follow when conducting business? What types of goals should it pursue? And what are the things that it can and cannot do in trying to achieve those goals? These are all questions answered by a constitution. So a constitution is a usually written plan of government. Do keep in mind that constitutions are not strictly reserved to countries or nations. States, corporations, even student organizations also adopt constitutions on a regular basis. In a sense, our syllabus might even be thought of as a sort of constitution for the course. But when we're looking at the United States Constitution, it is worth noting that this particular document is somewhat unique. For one thing, it is in fact the oldest written constitution still in effect in the world today. No other country has penned a longer-lasting plan of government than the one that we continue to live under even now. But it should be noted that there are some reasons why our Constitution has lasted so long. And to explore these, we need to understand its historical origins. So let's take a brief detour and skim over some history. Keep in mind that we are skimming over a lot of history, and that our coverage is therefore at best inadequate. This portion of the lecture is meant primarily to substitute, refresh, and reinforce lessons that are already being covered in great depth by your reading, and hopefully that you've already been exposed to by some of your other classes, either as a university student or during your high school career. One way or the other, the Constitution was not our first plan of federal government. That honor falls to what we call the Articles of Confederation. Now, I do want you to be familiar with the articles and some of the strengths and weaknesses associated with that document, as well as some of the ways that the Articles of Confederation were distinct from our current Constitution. But again, most of that will be covered by your handout for this week and the assigned reading materials. For now, just understand that the Articles of Confederation did create our first federal government, but that this government was very weak. You can think of our system at this time under the Articles of Confederation in the same way that you might think of the European Union today, a loose alliance of largely independent states agreeing to work together towards a common goal. In this case, the common goal of the 13 former colonies was national independence from Britain. But because of this, the Articles of Confederation basically created a government which had enough power to organize a war against Britain, and that's about it. So after the war ends, we do start to run into some problems. The federal government could not levy direct federal taxes, for example, so it was unable to gather the revenue that it needed to fund our military. 1 year after the Revolutionary War ends, we disband our army, and some people start to worry that the federal government is not strong enough to maintain law and order. This fear is really going to be fueled by events like Shays' Rebellion, where a group of indebted farmers seize a federal building to keep the courts from foreclosing on their loans. This fear that the federal government was too weak, we will find, was especially potent among the rich, who wanted to use a strong federal government as a tool that they could employ to protect their property and their money and their general interests against those of the poor. And of course, when rich people have worries, something is usually done about it. In this case, the federal government addresses the worries of the rich by calling for a constitutional convention. Ignoring dates and some details, the Constitutional Convention was a meeting of 55 delegates who came together to discuss some potential changes that might be made to the Articles of Confederation as a way to strengthen the federal government and shore up some of these weaknesses that had allowed Shays' Rebellion to take place. We did not want, at this time, a federal government to be quite as strong as what we'd experienced under the centralized and absolutist monarchies of Europe, but many felt that the Articles of Confederation went too far in the opposite direction. So we needed to fix this and to find a sort of happy medium. But those delegates who attended the Constitutional Convention had a peculiar understanding of what it meant to amend the Articles, and instead they wound up drafting an entirely new document, the Constitution of the United States. And although there have been some important alterations to that document in the interim, we do continue to live under this plan of government even to this very day. Now then, we've got the history out of the way. Why is it important to have that background information? Well, because it helps to contextualize an important point. The Constitution of the United States was a negotiated document. I do want you to keep this in mind because it may appear on your quiz for this week and on subsequent tests in the course as a whole. Remember, we had 55 separate delegates who attended the Constitutional Convention. And while many of these had very similar backgrounds and priorities, they were still individuals. Each of these individuals had their own set of ideas about what the Constitution should say, how powerful the federal government should be, what it should look like, and how it should function. The Federalists, for example, were led by Andrew Hamilton, and they wanted a very powerful central government, a monarchy, in fact. But the Anti-Federalists wanted to keep the federal government relatively weak and leave the meat of day-to-day governance up to the smaller, more locally representative, and more easily controlled state governments. And if you know anything about politics, you can guess what happens when you bring a bunch of politicians together and ask them to solve a problem. Well, they argue. We've got 55 different individuals, each with his own set of ideas about what the government should be like, but at the end of the day, we get only one constitution. Each delegate at the convention understands that things aren't always going to go his way. So they start splitting off into teams or factions and arguing about what the Constitution should say. And just like political parties today, these factions are never going to see eye to eye. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists are never going to see eye to eye. The big states and the small states are never really going to agree on everything. The states with a lot of slaves are going to have different wants, needs, and interests than the states that have fewer slaves. And again, they're not going to see eye to eye. The solution then is to compromise. If anything is going to get done, you have to have a little give and take. In this way, the Constitution can be characterized again as a negotiated document. It is a product of controversy and compromise. If you want an example of this, look at the Great Compromise discussed by your textbook. So, this is the first general characteristic of the Constitution as a whole that I want you to be familiar with. Again, it is a negotiated document. It is also important to know that the Constitution was, and in some regards still is, a revolutionary document. It is not, however, a modern Constitution. Let me explain. The Constitution was revolutionary in the sense that it was testing out some ideas about politics which had never been put into practice before. Or, well, more accurately, it had never been tried by the Europeans. We'll actually find that some Native American groups like the Iroquois Confederacy had been actively using a few of these key principles for a very long time before the United States was ever even founded. But in Europe, ideas about separated powers, checks and balances, so on and so forth, were just that, ideas. People had been talking about them for a very long time, but nobody had actually tried to apply these theories in the real world. Our Constitution was revolutionary then in the sense that it created a form of government which was, at the time, totally foreign to the framers who wrote that Constitution. It is not, however, a modern Constitution. Again, as I've already told you, it's the oldest written Constitution of any country in the world today. And in many respects, it does show its age. Our Constitution is somewhat dated in the sense that it lacks the comprehensiveness and the detailed language of more modern documents. If you look at the Constitution of a foreign country like South Africa, for example, or even the Constitution of a state like Oklahoma, you'll find that they tend to be very lengthy, thorough documents that detail virtually every aspect of any issue that a government might have to deal with. But our Constitution, our federal Constitution of the United States, makes no mention of many of the major problems that governments do have to deal with. It doesn't really talk about education or healthcare, for example, and yet we know that governments do need to make decisions that affect these areas of policy. The Constitution does supply some very valuable general principles, but it doesn't really say all that much about how we should apply these principles to specific cases. It tells us, for example, that we have a right to free speech, but it doesn't really give us any advice about how to interpret that freedom of speech. Is the freedom of speech broad enough to encompass, say, symbolic expression, like wearing an anti-war armband, or is it limited to literal, physical, verbal articulation? I don't know. The Constitution doesn't tell me. It lets the courts figure that out for us. And it doesn't make an effort to address the day-to-day issues of governance. That's left to Congress. In other words, our Constitution is very vague and very short. It hits on the big, prevailing, fundamental issues of governance in very general terms. The same cannot be said of other, more modern constitutions, which, again, tend to do a little bit more micromanaging of the governments that they create. Now, let's be clear. This is not necessarily a bad thing. Some people would argue that the very brevity and vagueness of our Constitution is the key characteristic which has allowed it to stay relevant for so long, that it is because of this brevity and because of this vagueness that our Constitution continues to survive and thrive in the modern environment. But, whether it's good or bad, understand that it is different, that it is not modern, even though it was, and arguably still is, somewhat revolutionary. So the Constitution is a negotiated document. It is not modern, but it was revolutionary at the time. And it's this last point that I want to elaborate on moving forward. I've told you now that our Constitution tried out some novel ideas. And what I would like to do moving forward is to look at what these key revolutionary principles of the Constitution actually happen to be. In general terms, the Constitution of the United States has 7 core principles. Now, we're going to skim over this for the time being, but we'll elaborate on many of these points in future lectures. Our discussion of federalism, for example, will be tackled in the second half of this week's lecture. So let's start with the first of these 7 core principles, the social contract. A social contract is an implicit agreement among members of a society to cooperate under some sort of centralized authority for social benefits. I'll go ahead and say that again. A social contract is an implicit agreement among members of a society to cooperate under some form of centralized authority for social benefits. Usually, this means that we sacrifice some measure of individual freedom to create a government with authority over our behavior in exchange for a certain level of law and order. Remember that most fundamental function of the government. Now, what's important about the idea of a social contract is that it implies that there should be some form of popular sovereignty or self-rule. In other words, it suggests that the people are the basis of government power. A contract is an agreement. So under our constitutional model of government, the government derives its authority from consent. In other words, the only legitimate form of government is government by the consent of the governed. And that's a fundamentally revolutionary idea for 2 reasons. First, consent can be withdrawn at any time. And if the government's power comes from consent, what this means is that we can, if we're dissatisfied with our government, change that government. Second, and again, it means that we are the basis of the government's power. The government's authority comes not from a divine right to rule, as many believed at the time that the Constitution was written, but from the people that it presumes to preside over. The second of the 7 core principles is that we've got what is called the rule of law. You can contrast the rule of law with the rule of man. When you've got a rule of man, whoever happens to be in charge at a given point in time is allowed to use their power as the leader in whatever way they see fit. But when you have a rule of law, governments cannot exercise their power arbitrarily. The government has to follow certain rules and guidelines about the use of its power. For example, under the rule of law, a government might not be able to deprive you of life or liberty without first providing due process. This is the case in the United States, for example. This is why the framers chose to write the Constitution down rather than taking the British approach of an unwritten constitution based on tradition. They wanted a set of rules that were laid out on ink and paper that were clear, set in stone, and could tell us what the government could and could not do, as well as how it should go about doing so. The third principle is republicanism. The United States is a republic. Now, sometimes we like to say we're a republic, not a democracy. But that's really kind of a false dichotomy. A republic is actually a type of democracy in which people elect representatives to rule on our behalf rather than getting together to have a direct vote every time a collective decision needs to be made. Republican governments, it should be noted, also tend to have constitutional limits and guidelines on the power of these elected representatives to help protect minorities from a tyranny of the majority. We don't want to exclude the people altogether, because if we did exclude the people, then they could be oppressed. But we don't want a pure, direct democracy either, because then we might have a situation where 51% of the population votes to enslave the other 49%. So we're not a pure democracy, but neither are we a tyranny. We are a republic. To summarize, then, we live under a constitutionally limited form of representative democracy known as a republic. The next 2 points on this list of 7 principles both have to do with the division and organization of government power. Federalism is a principle that power should be shared and divided across multiple different levels of government. The separation of powers is the idea that power should be divided across multiple different branches of government. But a level of government is not the same thing as a branch of government. One level of government is going to be distinguished from the next level by its degree of locality. For example, we have a state-level government in Oklahoma and a federal-level government of the United States. Oklahoma is a lower level of government because its authority is limited to a comparatively small, localized area. The federal government is a higher level of government because it covers much more territory. It is much less local. Branches, by contrast, are distinguished not by their degree of locality, but by their respective functions. As we shall see in future lectures, for example, we have a legislative branch which can make the laws and an executive branch which can execute and enforce those laws. We also have a judicial branch to help resolve disputes about how to interpret and apply those laws. The separation of powers tells us that each of these three fundamental functions of government should be spread out across different branches so that no one portion of the government can ever become too powerful. By separating power, we help to protect ourselves from a tyranny by creating competition within the government. Congress, wanting to maximize its own power and influence, will try to limit the president so that he doesn't take too much of the government's strength away from them. The executive branch, in turn, will do the same thing to Congress. And this leads us to the sixth of the 7 key principles in our Constitution, checks and balances, or what is sometimes called the balance of power. The concept of checks and balances is going to be closely related to, but distinct from, the idea of separated powers. Separation of powers, again, tells us that the government must be divided into multiple branches, each with its own peculiar set of functions. Checks and balances tells us that in dividing these functions, these powers across distinctive branches of governments, we need to make certain that we do so in such a way that each branch has enough power to keep the other branches from becoming dominant. For example, if Congress is getting too big for its britches, the president can control its influence by vetoing their legislation. On the flip side, if the president's beginning to abuse his power as the chief executive or the commander-in-chief by, let's say, misusing troops, well, Congress can control him by refusing to provide the tax funds that he needs to pay for his soldiers. Taken together, points 6 and 7 are the core characteristics of what we call the Madisonian model of government. And again, these ideas of separated powers and checks and balances had been bouncing around in European political philosophy for a very long time. But the United States was the first group of people of European descent to actually try these ideas out in practice. Again, I will remind you that the Iroquois Confederacy had been playing with these principles for a long time, but from the European perspective, the Madisonian model of government was a very new, novel, and revolutionary approach to running human society. Okay, the last of the 7 principles, the last and perhaps one of the most important principles of the Constitution, is that of limited government. Basically, the Constitution tells us that political power should be used only for a small number of specifically defined purposes, and that the scope and activity of the government should be legally limited to what is absolutely necessary for it to fulfill these core constitutional purposes. In other words, the authority of the government is limited to those powers specifically delegated to it by our Constitution. Everything else is a private matter and therefore outside of the government's purview. The Constitution, it is also important to know, includes a set of guarantees about what the government cannot do to us. These guarantees are mostly found in the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, which are collectively called the Bill of Rights. Now, don't let that name confuse you. Prohibitions on what the government cannot do to us are what we call civil liberties. Civil liberties should not be confused with civil rights, which really aren't going to show up in U.S. constitutional law until a series of Supreme Court cases in the early 1900s. But We'll talk about those later on. For now, understand that in protecting individual freedoms, our civil liberties and the Constitution creates a set of limitations on the government. To say that the government must respect our freedom of speech, for example, is to say that it cannot censor us. It cannot censor us. This is a limit on how the power of the government can be used. It cannot be used in a way that violates the freedom of speech. Okay? So, the inclusion of civil liberties in the Constitution, especially in the Bill of Rights, is another component of our constitutional principle of limited governance. But it is worth knowing that very few of our freedoms can actually be found in the body of the Constitution itself. Most of them are going to be found in a series of changes which have been made to the Constitution, starting with the Bill of Rights and moving forward. So let's take a moment to look at the three main components of the Constitution itself. As a document, the Constitution can be divided into three broad components. There's a preamble, there are the articles or main body, and then there are the amendments. We'll go through each of these in turn. First, we've got the opening paragraph of the Constitution. You probably know the language. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our prosperity, do ordain and establish the Constitution of the United States of America. Now, it's worth noting that this preamble was something of an afterthought. It was tacked on more or less last minute before sending the document forward for final ratification. But it's still very important, and not just because it sounds cool. It's really important because it is here that we find the concept of a social contract articulated in the Constitution. Read the language of this paragraph carefully. Who, according to the preamble, ordains and establishes the Constitution? Why, it is we, the people. In other words, the preamble tells us that the Constitution as a whole derives its authority over the people from the people through their consent, from their decision to ordain and establish it. So the preamble tells us that we are the basis of power and that the Constitution is a social contract. The second of the three major components of the Constitution is the main body, a set of 7 articles that provide a blueprint and a skeletal outline for the actual institutional structure of our government. They tell us what the government will look like and how it will operate. For example, Articles 1 through 3 identify the 3 branches of the government and explain their respective duties, functions, and limitations. The other 4 articles cover interstate relations, the process for amending the Constitution, the hierarchy of laws, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the next video, and the process by which the Constitution would ultimately be ratified. What the articles do not do, however, is provide us with very much information about our role in all of this. They tell us that the government will have 3 branches, and they tell us how it will exercise power. But they do not say all that much about what the government must do for us or cannot do to us. To learn about these civil rights and civil liberties, then, we're going to need to look at the final of these 3 main components of the United States Constitution, the amendments. There are exactly 27 amendments to the United States Constitution, and each one does serve a slightly different purpose. What you need to know for our purposes is that the amendments are a series of changes to the Constitution, and that it is in the amendments that we are going to find most, not all, but most of our civil rights and civil liberties. You'll also want to know that the amendments can be further subdivided into 3 smaller categories. First, we have the Bill of Rights. As I mentioned, the Bill of Rights is a term used in reference to the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution. These were all written and adopted at more or less the same time, pretty much immediately after the main body of the Constitution was ratified. Why? Well, To make sense of this, you need to understand some of the historical context. The main body of the Constitution was primarily written by Federalists who tended to be very wealthy and wanted a strong central government to protect their property from the poor. But many of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention who would ultimately have to agree to the Constitution if it was going to be ratified were anti-Federalists. And the anti-Federalists tended to represent people that were somewhat less well-to-do, and as a result, the anti-Federalists tended to be concerned that a very strong federal government could be abused by the rich to oppress the poor. To avoid this tyranny, they wanted to limit the federal government, which they did by drafting the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights essentially creates a series of civil liberties. And civil liberties, again, at their core, are prohibitions on government actions that would violate our basic freedoms. The Anti-Federalists agreed to ratify the main body of the Constitution if and only if the Federalists would, in exchange, agree to then ratify the Bill of Rights, which they ultimately did. So the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments, and it is here that we're going to find most of our civil liberties in the Constitution. The next set of amendments that we can group up together are the Civil War amendments, 13, 14, and 15. Okay? So we've got the Civil War amendments, 13, 14, and 15, and we're going to talk about these a little bit more later on. For now, understand that these three amendments were passed pretty much immediately after the Civil War, and that taken together, they will eventually form the basis for all civil rights laws in the United States. In particular, we've got the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, but again, we'll elaborate on that later on. The other amendments in our Constitution are all to be taken individually. They don't really have that much in common with one another, except that they are neither a part of the Civil War amendments nor a part of the Bill of Rights. Each of the remaining 14 amendments addresses a different issue. For example, Amendment 12 changed the procedure by which our vice president was selected, while the 17th Amendment established direct popular elections of U.S. senators who, if you didn't know, were previously being selected by state legislators rather than by popular votes. It's even possible to have one amendment which repeals another amendment. For example, the 21st Amendment repeals the 18th Amendment's prohibition on the sale or manufacture of alcohol. So there is very little that can be said in general terms about all of the remaining amendments in any collective sense. But what we do know is that each of them is a change to the Constitution, and that each one addresses a different issue, which at some point in the past our country had to deal with. Now, if you want more information on any of this, please see the Interactive Constitution web linked in this week's coursework folder. For now, however, we've concluded our discussion of the Constitution and some of the foundational principles that you need to know and be familiar with if you're going to make sense of lecture in future weeks. Be sure that before you proceed into Lecture B, you complete the second component in this week's reading materials. And other than that, you have a nice day.